They call me.
I think.
Yeah.
Scratchy Fish.
Owie. 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 Owie.
Scratchy Fish. fish. Ooh, scratchy fish.
Oh.
Ouch! What is this? Ouch! Yeah. Ouch! Ouch! Ow!